Hello, I'm Dahl Russell, and today I'm going to be talking to you and quizzing you a bit on the life of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and talking about his Symphony No. 33 in B-flat major. There's a link to a performance of the work in this video and a few links in the text below so that you can listen to different performances of it on different types of instruments and really get a feel of the music itself through different interpretations. By the age of 18, Mozart had composed 30 symphonies. That's hard to grasp. This symphony, composed when he was 23, is considered to be one of his later symphonies, one of the three that he wrote with the Parisian audience in mind. While away on his trip, he heard that his mother had died, and in addition to that sad news, the first two symphonies had not been well received. So this symphony, No. 33 in B-flat major, was the saving grace of the three. Part of that is quite possibly because the opening movement contains a folk theme similar to an Austrian Landler dance, and Landlers were beloved by Marie Antoinette. They reminded her of her homeland. And at this time, she was still young and beloved, and an arbiter of taste in France. Just the year before this, she had given birth to France's new prince and heir to the throne, so it was the height of her popularity. This work was generally very popular too because it has an overall light and cheery disposition. It is scored for one of the smallest combinations of instruments of all his later symphonies. Only 2 oboes, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, and strings. Symphony No. 33 is the smallest of his late symphonies and is lighthearted and witty, and though it's intimate at times, it rarely strays into sadness or introspection. It became one of the few symphonies that was actually published during Mozart's lifetime. Now, if you've looked through my YouTube page, you've seen several other talks about Mozart and his life. As a pre-concert lecturer, I have to talk about both Mozart and Beethoven quite a bit. So sometimes I can feel that I'm at a loss of what to say about their lives because most classical music listeners have read and heard most of it before. So this time, I thought I would turn the tables a bit and quiz you on your Mozart knowledge. Don't worry, no written essays required, and you won't be graded. I just hope you'll be game and dive in, and feel free to shout out. So first, who was Mozart's first teacher? His father. Do you know the name of Mozart's father? Johann Georg Leopold Mozart, who lived from 1719 to 1787. Do you know what the occupation was of Mozart's father? He was a violinist, a court musician, and a pedagogue. Leopold Mozart became a violinist at the court of the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg, and by the age of 38, he had risen through the orchestra's ranks to become the court composer, and 5 years later, he also became the Kapellmeister. His treatise setting forth his method of teaching violin, a treatise on the fundamental principles of violin playing, coincidentally published the same year as Wolfgang's birth, was long a standard text and was widely reprinted and translated. And still today, it's considered a resource for historical performance practice of the violin. Among his musical compositions are concerti for various instruments, symphonies, and other pieces. By any definition, he was extremely successful, with one of the top jobs a musician of his day could aspire to. It provided him with stability, a high position, the time and resources for composing, and the visibility of having his work performed for the nobility of Europe. Can you name any of the famous pieces composed by Leopold Mozart? Two of his most famous pieces are the Toy Symphony for two toys and chamber orchestra, something that's often heard on the radio during the holidays, and a trumpet concerto in D major, which is still a regular part of the repertoire of many trumpet players. Leopold definitely was invested in the teaching and promotion of his son. We still have to wonder if he might have been jealous of the international acclaim that his son achieved at such a young age and his continued acclaim, especially since Wolfgang seemed determined to insult his employers and otherwise shut doors to positions and opportunities that arose. That would have given the young Mozart the same sort of stability that his father had worked so hard for. That was undoubtedly a frustration of Leopold Mozart's. Changing the topic, did Mozart marry the girl of his dreams? No, he married her sister. The Weber family had 4 daughters, and all 4 of them were accomplished singers. Josephina and Aloysia were already quite acclaimed, and Aloysia was very beautiful, and her parents wanted her to marry very well, rank and money. So it was a bit like Pride and Prejudice, where the elder beautiful sister is expected to marry well, so Mozart was encouraged to engage his affections elsewhere. So there was Constanza, and the youngest sister was Sophie, who was still in her teens. So whether or not Constanza was his first choice, it seems she was his best choice, and a bit of jealousy may have helped. They broke up briefly when Mozart found out that Constanza had allowed a young man to measure her calves as part of a parlor game. Wanton Heuden! Once reconciled, despite his father's opposition and her parents' wish for delay, she scandalously ran away to his house, thereby ensuring either that she would be disgraced or that they would be married. They were married that day. By all accounts, they had a very happy marriage and were very well suited to each other. Both were high-spirited and obviously willing to flaunt convention. Josefina and Aloysia continued on with distinguished musical careers, and both of them actually performed in premieres of Mozart's works. Mozart was a member of a secret society that still exists today. It is said that their imagery exists within his opera, The Magic Flute. Do you know what that organization is? The Masons. Now, do you know what would have been the draw for a musician of Mozart's day to become a Mason? There was, of course, the social status of being a Mason. But in Mozart's youth, there were no public orchestras. Orchestras and musicians were within the ranks of the servants of a royal household, or the house of a nobleman. The only time when the public would usually hear an orchestra at this time would be once or twice annually, when the nobility either opened the home to hold an event, or held an outdoor concert, or held a concert in a public square for a special event. The Masons had their own membership libraries and orchestras, and during Mozart's lifetime, they became the closest thing that we could recognize today to a public orchestra. Mozart premiered works with them and conducted with them. Over time, the Masonic orchestras became quite revered and had been known to give performances for audiences larger than 600. The composer known as Le Mozart Noir, the Black Mozart, his name was Joseph Bologne, Le Chevalier de Saint-Georges, lived longer than Mozart and became the conductor of the Paris Masons Orchestra, the largest and most prestigious of its day. For one frame of reference, the Magic Flute premiered in 1791, only 2 months before Mozart's death, at a theater in the suburbs of Vienna. That theater had only been built 2 years before, so you can see how late it was in the 1700s that truly public performance venues existed. This was a very new concept. One reason for this is that the nobility considered that having a place for the public to congregate other than a church could lead to uprisings. And, arguably, they were right. 1790s, revolutions ensued. So meanwhile, up until this time, and just before his death, the only place for public performances was with the Masons. So we see why we have this affectionate familiarity with Masonic symbols within the Magic Flute, and we also see why that particular opera might not have been performed and premiered in a Mason space. It may have been poking fun at a few of their sacred cows, something that Mozart loved to do. Speaking of fun, what can you tell me about Mozart's sense of humor? Today we would call his humor very juvenile or sophomoric. He loved jokes about poop, and in his letters he made regular references to his bodily functions. Through this, we see that he really did enjoy pushing social conventions of proper conversation, and we are also reminded of how very young he still was, not so much a rebel as just sheltered enough to have a very teenage sensibility. Mozart had multiple connections to another composer, Karl Maria von Weber. Do you know what any of these connections were? There were two primary connections. They both studied with the Haydn brothers, Joseph and Michael Haydn, and we know that the Haydns were both very supportive and created a family-like atmosphere for their students. So this would have been a positive connection between them. But also, the second thing, remember his wife's last name was Weber, W-E-B-E-R. Karl Maria von Weber was her cousin. Their fathers were stepbrothers. And Karl Maria's father had added the von to his name to make them appear to be of a higher social class, the same way that Beethoven later added the von to his name. So they were related. Did Mozart achieve any rank or social station during his lifetime? This was a new one for me. Mozart had been knighted. In 1770, when he was still a teenager, only 14, Mozart was awarded the Papal Order of the Golden Spur, a knighthood. His father, for a while, made him sign his compositions Le Chevalier Amadeo, but Mozart soon dropped the formality. It's really clear that his father was very invested in nobility and titles and rank, and it's equally clear that this was the source for Mozart being very disinterested in these things. His lack of regard for nobility would have been not only because he had been praised by these people since he was little, but having traveled throughout Europe, he had had ample opportunity to see how boorish the nobility really were. Just one example, it was considered to be a mark of nobility and social status to spell and write poorly, because good spelling and good grammar was something that clerks and teachers did. These things implied that a person had to work, and for the nobility, the goal was to inherit income and collect rents, and to not know what it is to work. Being a soldier was the only activity fit for most royalty and nobility, and many of them weren't really very good at that either. Did you know that there is an animal species named after Mozart? The Eleutherodactylus Amadeus is a Haitian frog species named after Mozart because of the striking spectrum of sound frequencies it produces and the similarity between these and musical notes. The species was thought to have died out in 1991, but were reported as rediscovered in 2011. Of course, as well as these frogs, there are pets, cafes, orchestras, numerous cakes, innumerable children's choirs, and even asteroids named after Mozart. If you remain curious about the lesser-known facts of Mozart's life, do a web search on the phrase "things you didn't know about Mozart," and many, many articles and videos will pop up, a relatively painless way to learn some more about the life of one of the greatest composers of all time. I'm Dahl Russell. I hope you've enjoyed this and enjoy the music, Symphony No. 33. Thank you.